Hello, everyone. I'm Alex Rushing, an attorney in Husch Blackwell's Higher Education Group. Before we begin, I would like to cover a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your audience console, there are multiple application icons for your use during the program today. If you have any questions during the webcast, please submit via the question box. We will try to answer all questions during the webcast today, but we may run out of time because we have a lot of topical issues to cover today. A PDF of the presentation is available in the resources folder. This program has been approved for legal education hours. To report your hours, click on the CEU icon at the bottom of the screen. A certificate of attendance, including course numbers, will be emailed to you tomorrow, along with a recording of the webcast for watching and sharing. At the end of the program, please be sure to complete our short survey. We use your feedback to plan future programs that are applicable to your institutional needs. Actually, this topic is one that came to us through that very survey. So we really value the feedback and want to make sure we are giving you presentations that address issues that are top of mind for our clients and our colleagues. That is all for the housekeeping items. Let's get started with our program. Today we'll be discussing alcohol and other drug prevention on campus in the COVID-19 era. Joining me is Mary Kate Mullen. Mary Kate is an education, commercial, and healthcare litigator. In addition to her traditional litigation practice, Mary Kate regularly conducts comprehensive investigations for schools on alleged violations of institutional policies and federal civil rights laws. As I mentioned, I'm Alex Rushing, and I counsel colleges and universities on investigations, litigation, and compliance matters arising from a wide range of civil rights and educational funding issues, including alcohol and other drugs. So I'm very much looking forward to presenting with my colleague Mary Kate today on this vital topic. You'll see on your screen right now is the agenda that we hope to cover today. It's a very much packed agenda, and we're hoping to get through everything, but very much appreciate your questions, so please make sure those keep coming. First, we'll have Mary Kate discuss the importance of alcohol and other drug preventions given the ongoing pandemic and this COVID-19 era. Mary Kate will then talk about the legal implications for failed prevention, and then both Mary Kate and I will tag team the third part of our agenda, and that's related to your policies regarding AOD. Then I'll conclude with creating your drug and alcohol abuse prevention programs, as well as your biennial review. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Mary Kate to talk about the importance of alcohol and other drugs in this new pandemic era. Mary Kate?
Good afternoon, everyone. So our first topic is the importance of alcohol and other drug prevention in the COVID-19 era. I'm sure this presentation is timely for many of you as you are headed back to campus. It's also very timely in my personal life as well. Today is my baby brother's first Monday on his own college campus. I, of course, asked him to attend this webinar this afternoon, but he informed me he had better things to do with his time, of course. So why is regulating alcohol on campuses important in the COVID-19 era? Well, as many of you know, alcohol is associated with increased class absences, poor academic performance, and these both result in a lower grade point average. And you also might know that the majority of injuries, accidents, vandalism, sexual assaults, rape, fighting, and other crimes on and off college campuses are linked to alcohol and other drug use. In fact, lingering cognitive deficiencies from alcohol can last up to 48 hours after drinking. Heavy drinking can also lead to positive blood alcohol levels the next day, and this affects a student's ability to process and store information from class. Additionally, sleeping off a buzz can interfere with the sleep cycle, which can also interfere a student's ability to consume information. Now, during COVID-19, alcohol sales have shown an increase since March 2020. The heavy use of alcohol increases the risk of acute respiratory distress syndrome, which is one of the most severe complications of COVID-19. Alcohol and lack of sleep associated with drinking can deplete the immune system, which is obviously not good for students who are trying to fight off COVID-19. Additionally, anxiety, loneliness, and depression are often linked to increased alcohol consumption. Studies show that students have been highly impacted by the pandemic and that anxiety and depression are on the rise due to social distancing, not having a normal university experience, death in the family, illness in the family, and job loss. So what does this mean? Well, it means ultimately students are at a greater health risk than ever before. Not only are students at the risk of contracting COVID-19, but they are also at the risk of imbibing in more alcohol than before in recent history. So what about tobacco on campuses? Well, during early adulthood, it is common for intermittent tobacco use to quickly manifest itself into a lifelong habit. Studies have shown that there is an association between smoking and the severity of COVID-19 symptoms with patients. So additionally, like alcohol, smoking is a way for students to help manage their stress. So it would not be unsurprising if smoking is increased this fall semester due to the stress related to the pandemic. So if you have been considering a smoke-free campus in the past, COVID-19 might be an opportune time to execute those plans in an attempt to impact the COVID-19 on students' health. So what about marijuana on campuses? Well, marijuana suppresses part of the brain, which results in problems with attention, memory, and concentration. Marijuana also increases heart rate, weakens heart muscle, and affects blood pressure. This increase in heart rate can be a concern for someone who's already dealing with anxiety. And as I said earlier, anxiety has increased since COVID-19 due to social distancing, job loss, deaths, and illnesses related to the pandemic. So it would not be unsurprising if marijuana use on campus increases during COVID-19. What about other drugs on campus? Well, drug use overall is linked to decreasing the immune system, which is not great for students who are combating COVID-19. Studies also show that people who use opioids at high doses face challenges to respiratory health. And as you know, the respiratory system is greatly impacted by COVID-19. So other than a fatal overdose or just a life-threatening overdose, opioids can cause harmful decrease in oxygen in the blood. And this lack of oxygen can be especially damaging to the brain. So while brain cells can withstand short periods of low oxygen, they can suffer damage when the state persists. A chronic respiratory disease is already known to be linked to people who use opioids. And as you know, respiratory disease is also linked to COVID-19. So these two are intermingled, and it poses a great risk for students on campus. So how do we prevent drug use and alcohol on campus during COVID-19? Well, as you know, the World Health Organization recommends social distancing at 6 feet away from other people. Additionally, bars, casinos, nightclubs, and restaurants, and other places where people might consume alcohol increase the risk of transmitting the virus. Social distancing could reduce the availability of alcohol, and so COVID-19 social distancing presents an opportunity to reduce students' drinking and increase students' health. So how can we prevent this? Well, you could restrict indoor on-campus parties and gatherings. You could encourage positive behaviors like outdoor recreational activities that do not involve drinking or drug use. You could limit the number of people who can attend outdoor campus parties and gatherings through a ticketing system or another way involving campus safety or residents' life on campus. You can engage with campus organizations and try to think of a way to partner with them in contact tracing with COVID-19. Right now, we are aware that college students and other people are experiencing quarantine fatigue, and many people are ready to be back out socializing and getting back to life as a normal college student again. So it will obviously be a challenge to prevent these activities on campus this fall. So what are the implications of shifting to a smaller party or gathering? Well, smaller parties tend to be a bring your own beverage event, so there tends to be a lot of alcohol involved. It's harder to regulate smaller events than private events. However, because less people are attending, that could mean a reduction in DUIs, and it could mean this is better contact tracing for COVID-19. In order to prevent alcohol and drug use at smaller parties and gatherings, you might consider party patrols, social host ordinances, and responsible host training for students. And this would involve COVID-19, alcohol, and drug use. Best practices suggest that colleges and universities develop policies and procedures in advance of students returning to campus, and that colleges and universities engage in direct communication with national fraternities and sororities if an incident occurs in Greek life. Now, as Alex mentioned earlier, I am a litigator, so of course we needed to have some case law in this presentation today. So this is a recent case that just came down on July 27th, 2020 from the Supreme Court in Massachusetts. And as you have already probably heard from this presentation, yes, alcohol and drugs are present on campus, but why should we care? Well, we should care because there's great liability for colleges and universities when drugs and alcohol are involved. So in Healthman v. Northeastern, plaintiff was a female first-year student at Northeastern University, and she was walking home from a party with a male first-year student. The male and female first-year students engaged in what the plaintiff alleged to be non-consensual sex that evening, and they were both heavily intoxicated. Plaintiff alleged that the university failed to prevent her from sexual assault and that they knew that she was heavily intoxicated and could not consent to having sex. While the university claimed that it did not have responsibility for the female student because she chose to drink alcohol, and as a consequence, she faced harm due to that decision. Well, the Supreme Court of Massachusetts disagreed with the university. It upheld that universities have a duty to protect students from foreseeable criminal acts of third parties, even when criminal acts are made possible by the intoxication of a student victim. So they also said that when a college or university has actual knowledge of conditions that would lead a reasonable person to conclude that a student on campus is in imminent danger of serious physical harm due to alcohol intoxication, and that student is so intoxicated that that student is incapable of seeking help for herself, the college or university actually has a duty to take reasonable measures to protect that student from harm. So a college or university could be held liable if a student consumes too much alcohol in this situation and then makes a poor choice because of the alcohol consumption. Now, ultimately, the Supreme Court of Massachusetts granted summary judgment for the university because they found that the university was not put on notice that the student had too much to drink and could not consent to the act. But if the facts had been differently, this could have been a major loss for Northeastern University. And now I'm going to turn it back to Alex to talk about alcohol and other drug prevention policies.
Thank you, Mary Kate. We had a question come through that I want to address before we dive into those prevention policies, and that relates to party patrols. That was a phrase that Mary Kate used earlier. We weren't referring to it necessarily as a term of art, but rather how the National Center for Campus Public Safety refers to it, which is just neighborhood party patrols. Those are basically entities that are tailored to address unruly parties hosted by college students or young adults within the community and residential areas, and can sometimes be viewed as an effective tool in reducing problems associated with it. So I hope that answers that person's question, and we will continue on in my section related to alcohol and other drug prevention policies. So Mary Kate has explained the importance of alcohol and other drugs on our campuses especially in the COVID-19 era. So let's dive into the law a little bit deeper. We talked about the case law, now let's get into some regulations. The Education Department's General Administrative Regulations, Part 86, are the set of regulations by which colleges and universities are expected to meet the federal requirements of the Drug-Free Schools and Campuses Act of 1989. The Part 86 regulations require that as a condition of receiving funds or any other form of financial assistance under a federal program, an institution of higher education must certify that it has adopted and implemented a program to prevent the unlawful possession, use, or distribution of illicit drugs and alcohol by students and employees. So the regulations describe this institutional responsibility, and you'll see that guide currently on your screen. And it talks about how this must relate to illicit drugs and alcohol by students as well as employees on the institution's premises and as part of any of its education programs or activities. It's so important to comply with this because it's a condition of receiving federal funding. And we'll talk about that federal funding towards the end of our presentation as it relates to our biennial review and some financial fines that may come with it. So now that we know the background on the law, let's look into the specific requirements. So institutions must do three main things to ensure their programs comply with the EDGAR 86 minimum requirements. And you'll see those three requirements on your slide. The first is the annual notification, the second is annual distribution, and the third is the biennial report. We'll cover each of these three areas in more detail on the next few slides and dive into those a little bit deeper. Let's start with the annual notification requirement. The EDGAR 86 regulations contain specific requirements for the content of an institution's written notification and specifies the items that the annual notification to students and employees must comprise. Those are listed on your slide. They must include standards of conduct, legal sanctions, health risks, drug and alcohol programs, and disciplinary sanctions. But I'm always focused on the practical approach. So what exactly does it mean by all of those five categories? What's the best way of accomplishing those? So let's first start with that standard of conduct. Standards of conduct are broad statements that govern the behavior of students, staff, faculty, and other members of the institution's community. Standards can range from statements that simply prohibit illegal activities related to alcohol and other drugs, or they can reflect more specific expectations established by the institution. But the important part is covered on your slide. It must cover the prohibition of the unlawful possession, use, distribution of illicit drugs and alcohol by all students and all employees. But we have a little wiggle room in terms of what it can actually say. So then let's talk about that second requirement, that being the legal sanctions piece. The regulations, again, don't require anything in particular with regard to your approach for including this information in your AOD policies. The annual notification must include a list of applicable legal sanctions under federal, state, or local laws for, again, that unlawful possession or distribution of illicit drugs and alcohol. Many of our colleges and universities present this in a chart format, sort of a summary of federal, state, and local laws and sanctions. So this is worth reviewing regularly, and you can adopt that chart format, or you can have it in narrative format. Again, there's nothing that's specifically prescribed by the regulations. Other institutions use a combination of styles that's most effective for communicating this to their campus communities, which is what I love. You can cater this really to what meets your institution's needs best. And with that, we're at our first poll question, which I'm really excited about. So this question asks, does your alcohol and other drug policy include specific sanctions under federal, state, or local laws for the unlawful possession or distribution of illicit drugs or alcohol? And your four options are yes, no, only for alcohol, or I don't know. And we'll wait a few seconds to give folks a chance to respond to that question. I see the results slowly trickling in, which I love seeing. Thank you, everyone. Okay, I think we've received the results, and let's see. So we have about 65% that have said yes, that it is covered. About 6.7% say that no, this issue is not covered. And then about 27% of the folks attending say that they're not sure about this. So this is an area for those of you who are in the no category or the I don't know, maybe to go back and look through your AOD policy and make sure that this is something that's covered. I hope this is an opportunity and maybe taking our slides back and doing a quick review of that to double check. So we'll move on to the next slide. On the slide, you'll see that this is a map from the National Conference of State Legislatures describing which states have legalized the recreational marijuana use for adults. And you'll see those states are highlighted in green. I'm currently in my Creve Coeur, or my St. Louis office, my home office, but my home state of Illinois is one of those states in green. And so if you're one of those states, we wanted to make sure that we highlighted that for you. So if your policy does not include specific state or local sanctions for marijuana use, you should look at adding it to your policy. With students and employees from different states, there's a good chance that students and employees on your campus are unfamiliar with your state marijuana laws. If you're in a state that permits it or doesn't, that is something to be cognizant of. And remember, keeping that federal funding requirement always in the back of our mind. So let's go back and we'll talk a little bit about that third requirement that we talked about in the annual notification, and that's related to health risks. So every institution has to distribute this information about health risks associated with alcohol and illicit drug use. And Mary Kate and I reviewed a lot of alcohol and other drug policies this summer, and we noticed that some policy statements summarize health risks in the form of a chart. Some institutions use that chart to show for each prohibited class of substances the risk of dependence, possible short-term effects, possible long-term effects, the effects of overdose. And then other institutions that we looked at may include the health risks portion of the policy as a descriptive paragraph, and then a chart, or just a descriptive paragraph. Again, we've got some flexibility here. A best practices tip that we've seen in our practice is including a statement referencing the National Institute on Drug Abuse's webpage regarding specific drugs and their potential health effects. Having something like, for more information about the health risks associated with particular types of drug and alcohol use, please visit, and then you insert that link. This webpage is updated regularly and provides a significant amount of information that may be helpful for students and employees, which is why we recommend it. So that brings us to our fourth requirement within that annual notification, and that's related to your drug and alcohol programs. So you must state that you have a list of drug and alcohol programs related to counseling, treatment, rehabilitation, and that they're available on your campus, within your campus community. Something new that we've seen within this COVID-19 era is talking about telecounseling as a resource, which I love seeing my clients preemptively put that information in. When I saw that in track changes, that made my nerdy higher education lawyer heart very happy because I think that's great, and that's something that we never really saw in these policies before, but it's certainly something that is coming up now that we're in the virtual world of COVID-19. Let's move on to that fifth requirement, and that's related to disciplinary sanctions. The annual notification has to include a description of the range of disciplinary sanctions that you may impose if the standards of conduct are violated. Plus, you have to have an explicit statement that these sanctions will, in fact, be imposed. Please make sure that your sanctions section is clear and easily comprehensible to students and employees. This is something where this past summer with our summer associates, we actually had some of them review that language because they're much closer to being students, they still are students, than we are. And so having them sort of review our language was really helpful to get it to be in a position where it was more easily understandable. So that may be something you all consider is actually having your students take a look at your language and see if there's areas to increase clarity. So that brings us to our next poll question. This question asks, disciplinary sanctions that apply to faculty and staff may differ from one another. And the two options are true or false. And we'll give folks a little bit of time to answer this. I see answers are slowly trickling in. Just a few more seconds. Okay, let's check out those results. So we had a little bit of distinction. We have about 60% of folks that say it's true and about 40% that say it's false. So the answer here is true, and this is because of the terms that may be set forth in your collective bargaining agreements. Now, for some of you at your institutions, you may have been talking about your actual institution, that the sanctions don't differ, but they can differ depending on if you have collective bargaining agreements in place. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mary Kate to talk about the annual distribution piece of everything. Mary Kate?
So now that we've talked about notification, how do you distribute this notice? Well, Edgar 86 requires that colleges and universities distribute the notification requirement in writing to all students and all employees. This includes a student or an employee who may join the campus community later in the semester or the following semester. You need to make sure that these new students or new employees also are distributed the notification. Best practice is to include the annual distribution via email, because that way you have a record that the student or employee received the notification requirement. Now I'm going to talk to you about different strategies for distribution. This includes creating a readable policy, distributing policy summaries, incorporating the policy into frequently read documents, distributing the policy as widely as possible, and providing incentives to students for reading the policy. So how do you create a readable policy? Well, as Alex mentioned earlier, one way to do this is to have charts or other appealing graphics that will cause a student to read the policy. Also, it's important to include engaging as opposed to legalistic writing. You may want to include bulleted lists, underlined, bolded words, anything that may hold the students' and employees' interest. One example of a policy that you might have, or you might know of other colleges and universities that have it, is a Good Samaritan policy. And this policy encourages students to report to campus safety or residence life when a student is impaired and in need of assistance. And it says that even if the student who is reporting that a student has drank too much and might need assistance, that this student will not get in trouble or any alcohol violation for drinking herself. So, of course, this policy is important to be it needs to be readable and easy for students to understand so that there's no confusion if an alcohol violation is later issued. Many Good Samaritan policies will include language such as a student is exempt from an alcohol violation unless the student has a repeated lack of self-care for herself or himself and the community. So having that in a readable and understandable way will prevent any confusion if an alcohol violation is later issued. Of course, Good Samaritan policies do not prevent action by local, state, or federal authorities. Your campus may also have the Good Samaritan policy in a form known as the medical amnesty policy. They are very similar. Now, what about policy summaries? Some colleges and universities summarize their alcohol and other drug prevention policy in the form of a letter that they send out annually to students. And this letter is briefer than the actual policy and will help students understand the policy itself. Now it's time for a poll question. So with partially and wholly virtual classes this fall, does your institution have a plan to redistribute your alcohol and other drugs policy if and when classes resume on campus in 2021? And your choices are yes, no, I've not thought of this, or still deciding. I'll give you a few moments to answer this question. All right, let's see our results. Okay, so it sounds like 40% of you are already being proactive and deciding to redistribute your alcohol and other drugs policy if you resume classes next semester. And as a lawyer, I love hearing that. I like that you're already staying on top of things and thinking that, students and employees need to be reinformed when it's a new normal once again, hopefully in January. For those of you, about 26% says, I have not thought of this. 21% says still deciding. You may consider redistributing the policy just because students will need to reacclimate to campus again, and it would be a great reminder for them to have this redistributed so that they know what the policy is. Now, one way to distribute the policy is to incorporate it into frequently read documents. This includes books, planners, calendars, and class schedules, anything that a student might read pretty frequently. One advantage of COVID-19 is having the opportunity to incorporate the policy into additional frequently read documents. As you probably know, COVID-19 presents a student with a lot more information that they need to read. This includes virtual learning information, COVID-19 testing information, and other campus health information that students are required to read and sign before returning to campus. So this allows colleges and universities another opportunity to get the policy in front of their students with COVID-19. It's also important to distribute the policy as widely as possible. This means placing the policy on brochures, handbooks, mass emails, posters, orientation materials, door hangers in the residence halls, and flyers that might be attached to parking permits. And as I just said, distribution during COVID-19 actually increases the areas where you can distribute the policy. You might consider placing the policy on a link to a virtual classroom platform, and that way it's easily accessible to students when they're logging on to their virtual classes. Now, what about incentives for reading the policy? Well, when I taught kindergarten through second grade camp, we always gave them candy for incentive to do something. Now, I know candy doesn't work the same way with college students. So you might say, how can we actually get college students to read this? Well, many of our colleges and universities actually take advantage of the class registration system and require students to read the policy and sign and say that they have read the policy before they can register for classes. You also might consider requiring students to read the policy before having an in-person or virtual academic advising session. And this way, students say, yes, I've read the policy, and you have a record that they have read the policy and know what the policy is. I'm going to turn it back to Alex to talk about creating your drug and alcohol abuse prevention program in the COVID-19 era. Alex?
Thank you, Mary Kate. So now that you know how alcohol and other drugs relate to COVID-19 and have the legal framework for your policies, let's talk about the practical side of actually creating your drug and alcohol prevention program in this new COVID-19 era. Colleges and universities must adopt a drug and alcohol abuse prevention program. Sometimes it's referred to as a DAP, and I try to not use my higher ed acronyms all the time. I try to give the full program name, but occasionally I will refer to it as that during the program. So I want to make sure you all know when I say DAP what I mean. These programs are a set of related measures or activities related to drug and alcohol abuse prevention with a particular long-term aim. A common misconception is that your alcohol and other drug policy is the program, but a program is more than a policy. The policy should outline the programs and other actions to be taken, but it's more than just your AOD or your alcohol and other drug policy. So best practices suggest that colleges and universities take a comprehensive prevention approach that combines traditional education programs along with other strategies aimed at changing the physical, social, legal, economic environments on campus in your local communities and that surround your campus. A comprehensive program includes areas that bring together all members of your institutional community. They bring together faculty, administrators, students, staff, parents, alumni, anyone else in order to develop a strong and effective policy as well as program. And we've highlighted on your screen some of those areas, but you all know exactly which groups you want to be targeting and which groups you want to bring together. And so making sure that all of those groups are covered within this approach is really important. So the three main goals of ADAPT must be to decrease the availability of alcohol, increase the number and variety of alcohol-free social activities for students, and 3, create a climate that discourages high-risk drinking. And I want to focus on that last piece, the creation of a climate that discourages high-risk drinking. And so we'll talk a little bit more in depth about that in the coming slides. So based on best practices, DAP programs and alcohol and other drug policies that make a difference include strategies that are listed on your slide, such as forming partnerships with local communities to ensure that alcohol is not served to minors or to intoxicated students, keeping the library, recreational facilities, other community or local events open longer. And related to that and that forming the partnership, we've talked about that throughout this presentation, and making sure that it's more of a holistic approach as opposed to keeping it within a certain delineation within your institution. Bringing together the community as well as your campus community are really important with regard to your DAP program and your AOD policy. Here are some additional strategies to consider. Again, these are not requirements, but things we've seen work effectively in our experience. And so some of those are listed on your slide. Eliminating alcohol industry support for athletic programs if you're an institution that has athletics, restricting alcohol promotions, including advertisements on campus, monitoring school organizations or sponsored organizations by your institutions to ensure compliance, and providing a wide range of alcohol-free social and recreational activities, which Mary Kate touched on earlier in our presentation. Providing alternatives is where we've seen a lot of our clients have success in this area in creating their DAP programs. So we'll move on to this slide, and this is the final slide of the areas to consider as you look at your DAP and your AOD policies. These are areas related to disciplining repeat offenders and those who engage in conduct that is associated with substance use and abuse, considering whether notification should go out related to individuals who are engaging in those activities, as well as social media and other media campaigns about informing students, making students aware. And like Mary Kate talked about earlier, this is an opportunity during the COVID-19 era to really use technology to our advantage and to try and get the word out there about what resources, policies, and procedures and programming is available for your campus community, not just for your students, but also your employees. And so keeping that all in mind is really important. So you may be asking yourself about new or unique things to consider for your programs amid the current pandemic. And on this slide, you'll see some of those areas to consider, including alcohol, drug use, and smoking and materials discussing the risks of COVID-19. The third bullet point that I want to focus on is the prohibition of using disposable cups at on-campus events. That actually came to me by a client who was on this very webinar I see, and I loved that idea. And so I told him I would include it in my presentation. He told me that would be okay. I thought that was such a phenomenal and innovative thing to really be thinking about, practically speaking, when we know certain types of activity are happening related to that sort of disposable cup and drinking game use, knowing that individuals may be sharing those cups and trying to add emphasis and alternatives to that or to address it head on. I thought that was such a great and innovative idea. I would be remiss if I didn't mention it. So for certain forms of federal funding, as we talked about earlier, institutions must certify compliance. In most situations, a certification is included as part of a standard application under the representations and certification section. You all know this relates to your federal funding and it's important for your campus community. That's why we're bringing this presentation to you. But we're going to dive into a little bit more about that drug and alcohol abuse program review, and then some of the financial implications that may relate to that federal funding that you may not have thought about or thankfully haven't experienced. So you'll see on this slide, this relates to reviewing your DAP policy. Every other year within the biennial report, your DAP must be reviewed and reassessed. Reviewing the prevention programs is a really complex process and relies on a clear description of your alcohol and other drug-related problems, strategic interventions, and desired outcomes. It's really important to make sure that you're complying with this and really taking a critical look at evaluating the plans that you have in place, as well as reassessing what's worked and what hasn't worked in prior years. To conduct a DAP inventory, colleges and universities should consider listing all the activities that compose their prevention program and identify the effectiveness of these efforts at meeting prevention goals and outcomes. This inventory and assessment is best done as a team approach from the various departments on your campus that handle alcohol and other drug issues. We've highlighted some of those on your screen: the residential life staff, campus security, athletics, other staff that's involved, Office of Institutional Equity, things like that. All of the campus organizations and departments that you think may have a hand in this should be included in this team approach. So in order to conduct a policy inventory, policies are identified and then evaluated for effectiveness, consistent with enforcement. One question to ask when evaluating for consistency would be, are all types of students held to the same policy standard and sanctioned for similarly situated violations? Another question when you're evaluating your policy for effectiveness is whether colleges and universities should look at their program goals and outcomes and identify whether or not the policy they have implemented is moving the institution's goals and outcomes in the right direction, in the direction that they want to be moving forward in. So that brings us to our biennial review. We're in the home stretch here, and I'm excited because we have a great opportunity to answer some of the awesome questions that have been coming through. And so I want to make sure we take the time and do that as well. We would obviously be remiss if we didn't cover the biennial review, especially in 2020, 2021. And so we'll dive really deep into this because I know a lot of you who suggested this as a presentation topic were really focused on the biennial review part. So I hate that we're bearing the lead, but we wanted to make sure you stayed on our webinar for as long as possible. And so we will dive into that process as well. So the drug-free schools and campuses regulations also require colleges and universities to obviously conduct a biennial review of their AOD programs and policies. But the regulations don't dictate what a biennial review should include, how it should be conducted, or the format in which it should be presented. Instead, institutions are given latitude in preparing biennial review reports to accommodate various campus types, whether you're a public, a private, a 2-year, a 4-year, a community college, as well as your institutional local community, and to honor the uniqueness of each institution, which is one of the reasons I really love this area of the law. It really does allow you all to cater to your student population and your employee population, which again, I really love. I think that's where we get into a lot of fun in higher education. And so that brings us to our next poll question. This question says, campuses are given latitude in preparing biennial review reports. I'm trying to do a quick comprehension check and see who's listening and who may not be, who's got me muted and who doesn't. So our two options are true or false. And I'll give you a few moments to answer that poll question. I see our answers are slowly trickling in. I want to give everyone a chance to make sure they're able to click that submit button and I don't move too quickly to our next slide. Okay, I think we have a majority. So the answer that most folks have given is 72% say true, that campuses are given latitude in preparing their biennial review reports. And the answer is true. The U.S. Department of Education's regulations, those Edgar Part 86, do not dictate what a biennial review should include necessarily, or how it should be conducted, or the format it should be presented in. Instead, you're given that latitude. And so that makes things interesting and fun sometimes, but can also be difficult and challenging for some of our clients. And so we're going to talk about some of those objectives and other sort of practical tips to hopefully, if you haven't considered some of these areas, maybe you consider them this year. So the biennial review has two objectives. One is to determine the effectiveness and to implement any needed changes to alcohol and other drug prevention programs. And two, to ensure that campuses enforce the disciplinary sanctions for violating standards of conduct consistently. And I wish I could have a stylist right now, because I would really underline the words consistently. That's your key within that second objective that I want to make sure all of the universities and colleges that are on the line really understand. That's going to be your critical piece. And we'll talk about the financial aid implications later, but that's really going to be where we see some of our issues. So based on our experience, this slide focuses on some common pitfalls to avoid. I want to focus really on two of them. The unfamiliarity with the law. Hopefully this one we've helped you all with, that you're now familiar with what the law requires and what must be in your alcohol and other drug policies and what should be considered in your DAP program. And then two, making compliance only a once-a-year effort. This is a common pitfall and a misconception that we really want to dispel during this presentation. Yes, it must have that annual distribution that Mary Kate talked about earlier, but this is really an ongoing process. Any of my Dean of Students on the line, you all know that alcohol and other drugs is not an annual thing. It is a daily issue that you all are handling in terms of compliance with. And we want to make sure that all of our campus administrators and other constituents are really cognizant of the fact that this is a vital area and to make it a priority. I think other areas, including those that I focus on, like Title IX and Clery, really get a lot of focus as of late, especially all of you having survived the August 14th date of implementation last Friday for Title IX. But this is another area where we see that pitfall of making this sort of a compliance effort only once a year. And we really want to dispel that myth on this presentation. So when you are preparing your biennial review, you may be thinking about some of the things to consider. So we briefly touched on this earlier. It's a common practice for the biennial review to be conducted with a task force or a committee approach that's responsible for reviewing the AOD policies and DAP programs. This task force should comprise a broad representation of campus constituents in promoting the health and safety of the campus community. Again, this should include individuals like campus law enforcement. I see a lot of those folks are on the line right now, which I really appreciate. Student health services, personnel or human resources, student affairs offices, residential life, housing officers. I see a lot of folks from those offices on the line too, which is great. I'm so glad. It's interesting seeing the attendee list has been really amazing because all of you are from such a wide range of offices within your institutions that this really shows that this does cover all areas of campus. And so I really love seeing that because that's an approach we really advocate. And then on this slide, you'll see some best practices when you're conducting your biennial review, including descriptions of the alcohol and other drug program elements, certain statements and summaries regarding strengths and weaknesses, procedures for distribution, copies of the policies, and then any other recommendations. Traditionally, the biennial review reports have ranged from as few as 2 to almost 30 pages. In order to meet the first objective of the biennial review, which is determining the program's effectiveness and identifying and implementing needed changes, a school should follow several steps. The more thorough the biennial reviews include the following features that are listed on your screen and that we just went over. And so those are hopefully some that, we offer this as a PDF, as I mentioned in the beginning of our presentation. Hopefully you all can use this as sort of your PDF guidepost when you're assessing your biennial review and your policies and your programs this fall. Standards of practice are articulated by these well-known professional organizations and can be a great guiding point for taking an inventory of prevention programs and identifying gaps in development of a comprehensive prevention initiative. They can also act as a framework for prevention services. And so we've highlighted just a few on your screen there, but there are many others, and those are just some to consider and hopefully serve as a baseline that you all do in your biennial review. So an institution establishes consistent enforcement of sanctions by documenting that the college or university treats similarly situated offenders in a similar manner. One way to do this is to submit a chart that lists each case without identifying information, of course, in order to protect confidentiality, and presents the particulars of the offense, mitigating or aggravating circumstances, and disposition. By organizing the list so that similar cases are grouped together, an institution can facilitate comparisons across situations. Really, you'll see I mentioned the word chart so many times across this presentation, and I think that's because it's so much easier to read and comprehend from your various groups. And so I always think that as you're assessing this, I always prefer chart format, and so that's why I'm suggesting it. It's not a requirement by any means, and that was one of the questions that came through. You've mentioned charts a lot. Is that something that's dictated? No, it's not. We're just suggesting that from an organizational perspective. And so then when you're measuring your policy and program effectiveness, a subset of the principles of effectiveness that are most applicable to institutions can be summed up as designing programs based on a thorough needs-based assessment of objective data, establishing a set of measurable goals and objectives linked to identified needs, implementing prevention activities that research or evaluation have shown to be effective in preventing high-risk drinking or other types of behaviors associated with alcohol and other drugs, use evaluation results to define, improve, and strengthen the program and policy, and redefine goals and objectives as appropriate. And you'll see some of those that are listed within your screen. Here are some more recommendations for measuring effectiveness. But remember, one size doesn't fit all, so make sure you're employing strategies that are best for your institution. We tried to cover such a wide range, knowing what type of attendees we would have on this seminar. Thankfully, so many of you registered in advance that we were able to have a really good framework and be able to account for some of those distinctions. But this really isn't, like I said, a one-size-fits-all approach. And it's super important that you consider what works best for your institution and your campus community and making sure that it's catering to those particular needs. So in fall 2018, this was most likely when your institution completed your 2016-2018 biennial review reports. So that means that now's the time for the 2018-2020 biennial review reports. It's a great opportunity. You may not be in that group, but that's what we've seen as sort of the majority. So this is the year. This is a great opportunity to take this and sort of run with it. And hopefully we've offered some great suggestions and opportunities for you all that maybe you didn't consider based on best practices as well as our experience in this area. So as I mentioned in the beginning, I didn't want to bury the lead, and yet I did. It's our last substantive slide dealing with financial consequences as it relates to this area. And this is one of the things that I think a lot of institutions may not know about, or certain folks may know about, but not everybody within the institution. So I want to make sure that I know a lot of you are going to share our presentation, which we really appreciate, to other administrators and faculty and staff at your schools. And so we want to make sure that this is one of those slides that everybody sees, because it's not just a threat of pulling federal funding, which is always a threat from the Department of Education, but it's more than just that. It's also these individual potential fines that may occur. And again, we see this come up a lot in the Clery context, where I think a lot of folks know their Clery fine potential. But I don't know that everyone understands this sort of Alcohol and Other Drugs and Drug-Free Campuses Act, the fines associated with that. And so I wanted to highlight that on this particular slide. So between November 2014 and September 2018, the U.S. Department of Education imposed $739,000 in fines for the drug-free schools and communities violations across 36 different institutions in the United States, with the highest potential cost of noncompliance increasing during this period from what used to be $35,000 per violation to almost $56,000 per violation. So it even increased the per violation basis that may occur. In September 2018 alone, 8 colleges were fined for violations, with fines reaching $38,500. So this is really a great time to look at your policies, to look at your programs and your biennial review, and not fall into that category of institutions that may be subject to any fines as a result. And so with that, I'm going to answer some of the questions that we received during the presentation, and one related to our Good Samaritan and amnesty policy that Mary Kate talked about. And it sort of is related to what we've been talking about, but not exactly related to it. And it talks about including that language in your new sexual harassment policy. And although I love Title IX, that isn't exactly what we're talking about today, but I will make sure I address that question. If you're an institution in Illinois, that's got to be in there. You have a specific state law that talks about your amnesty policy. So make sure your new sexual harassment policy has it. And we saw a lot of institutions that, even though the federal regulations didn't require that amnesty or Good Samaritan policy in their sexual harassment policies, they made a reference to it, which I really liked. I like the idea of including, whether you're required to or not, including language that references an amnesty policy. I think that's a really good approach, and anytime we can link to other policies within each other, I think that just helps understanding, and I think it helps cater to especially student needs with regard to reporting. And so unfortunately, that's all the time that we have for questions. We did receive other questions, and we'll do a great job of making sure we answer those afterwards via email. So really appreciate those of you who asked questions during our webinar. We were only able to get to a few, but we want to make sure we thank all of you for attending and joining us today. We hope that the information was helpful to you and your institution. As a reminder, this program has been approved for legal education hours, and to report your hours, click on the CEU icon at the bottom of the screen. A certificate of attendance, including course numbers, will be emailed to you tomorrow, along with a recording of the webcast for watching and sharing. We know that many of you love to share the webinar with your colleagues, and we absolutely encourage you to do so. There's a separate link that will be sent via email. We want to make sure that if you plan on sharing it, you absolutely do so, and you have our permission to do that as well. I always love adding that piece. When my clients ask me if they're permitted to share the webinar, I say, go ahead, please do. We really appreciate you sharing it. Be sure to also complete our short survey. We use your feedback to plan for future programming that's applicable to your institutional needs. As I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, this presentation actually came to us from several requests from clients and colleagues to include a presentation about alcohol and other drugs, as well as the biennial review, because it's now the new cycle year. And so we really do look at your feedback from that. And so please take the few moments it takes to make sure to fill out that information. We certainly look at it and we certainly review it. And our next upcoming webinar that we'll be talking about over the next September month, we're going to be talking a little bit more about mental health issues on campus and situations arising related to that. And so I'm really looking forward to our September webinar. It'll be on September 21st. Demetrius Peterson and Teresa Molyneux, Demetrius from our Kansas City office and Teresa from our St. Louis office, like Mary Kate and me, will be presenting on that topic. And then we have a few more topics coming for the rest of the year. We really appreciate all of you joining. And this concludes our webinar. Thank you.